Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Yuki Shirairo, Assistant Professor in Political Science Department and the faculty member of the Center for Japanese Studies, and I am the host today. Before introducing the speaker today, I want to make general announcements from the Center for Japanese Studies. The first announcement is about the next week's noon lecture. Please join us next week on Thursday, February 27th for the lecture Editing Observation, Filmmaker Soda Kazuhiro Demonstrates His Method by Soda Kazuhiro, a former Toyota visiting professor. This talk will be held in this room, Weiser 10th floor, and it is in person only, not on the webinar. There are film events. Next Tuesday, we will also be holding a screening of one of his documentaries, The Cats of Gokoku Shrine, in Angel Hall, Auditorium A, at 7 p.m. Soda-san will attend this screening in person, and this film focuses on Gokoku, a small Shinto shrine home to dozens of street cats. This special screening is free and open to the public. Looks like a cute cat. And for our regular film series, please join us tonight at 7 p.m. for the CJS Winter Film Series screening of Kakekomi at the State Theater. Kakekomi tells the story of women seeking refuge at Tokeji Temple in the Edo period. Next Tuesday, that's another film event. Join us for a screening of Bounce Cowgirls. Cowgirls, I guess, at 7 p.m. at the State Theater. Bounce Cowgirls follows the journey of three girls in Shibuya as they strive to make as much money as possible to help one of them fulfill her dream of escaping to New York for a better life. Tickets for both films can be purchased on Marquee Arts website, and please check out our website and social media pages for more CJS films and events. For attendees joining the webinar on Zoom, webcams and microphones have been muted. We invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit questions, and our presenter will address as many as possible. The live transcription feature is enabled. If you'd rather not have captions, you can turn this feature off in the bottom right corner. Okay, that was kind of a long announcement. And let me introduce Professor Kenneth McElwain, Professor of Comparative Politics at the Institute of Social Science, University of Tokyo. Professor McElwain received his PhD from Stanford University in 2005. I want to emphasize that before he assumed his current position in 2015, he taught at the University of Michigan and was a member of the CJS, and he has a lot of friends in this room and on campus. His research interests are in comparative political institutions, including constitutional design, public opinion, and international norms. He has published numerous articles in top journals in political science and related disciplines, including the Journal of Politics, International Journal of Constitutional Law, and the Review of International Organization. He also published a book in Japan in 2022, the English translation of whose title is the Universality and Originality of the Japanese Constitution in Quantitative Perspective. This is the front matter of the book. Today, he will be speaking on his work on public attitudes toward the Constitution in Japan. And thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My friends, it's wonderful to be back at the University of Michigan, especially to have this opportunity to speak at the Center for Japanese Studies noon lecture series. I'll be talking today about sort of a combination of things. One, to discuss work that I've been doing on constitutionalism in Japan, but also showing you some preliminary results on a topic that I've become very interested in, which is the theoretical concept of constitutional legitimacy. It's not my first time speaking at CJS. I actually found the opening page of the last time I spoke here, Will Japan Amend Its Constitution? I gave that talk in March 2015. I also found the photograph that I used for that talk. I think I'm more distinguished now, hopefully wiser. But this talk became the foundation of the book that Yuki kindly introduced. And the reason I became interested in the Japanese Constitution from a political science perspective is twofold, but about the same phenomenon. This figure that you're seeing now shows the lifespan of all current constitutions, or the constitutions that have survived the longest. And lifespan means the number of years since the Constitution has been ratified. So some of these are very familiar. The oldest standing national constitution, and I should say these are written constitutions, is the American Constitution from 1789. The Belgian, the Dutch, the Canadian follow. But there are two in this figure that are shown with a red bar. Japan, ratified in 1946, and Denmark, 1953. These are the two constitutions that have not been amended. Put differently, the Constitution of Japan is the oldest unamended constitution in the world. And it is an outlier in the sense that there's sufficient empirical work about constitutional design that suggests that constitutions that do not get amended periodically, that do not update its contents to meet new national priorities or the evolving norms and priorities of citizens, will become obsolete and will be replaced. So I became very interested in this question of how the Constitution of Japan has survived, which became the foundation of this book. I should have picked an easier English language title to say. I realized after the fact, it looked good on paper. I mean, I like the title, it's just a mouthful. But what this book does is it uses data from 900 written constitutions since the 18th century to understand what type of constitutions last longer and what type of constitutions are amended more frequently. And the core argument is that the longevity of the Constitution of Japan, which, by the way, I'll use the acronym COJ to describe the Constitution of Japan. The main predictor of constitutional survival is the number of human rights that are enumerated. Constitutions that have more rights, and my argument is that tend to receive greater legitimacy and reverence from citizens, and therefore tend to last longer. On the other hand, the frequency with which constitutions are amended is related to the degree to which political institutions are specified in the Constitution. Globally, 70 to 80% of constitutional amendments are to things like the electoral system, powers of local versus central government, term limits for presidents and officers in the legislature. And what allows the Constitution of Japan to formally be unamended is the Japanese Constitution uncommonly leaves most of these details to be determined by law. So the same changes, such as reforming the electoral system fundamentally in 1994, or reorganizing the structure of local governments, things that would require constitutional amendments in many other countries can be done through legislation in Japan. But I end the book by noting that the vagueness of the Constitution, the latitude it gives to legislators, has problematic qualities, not least of which is that, taking the electoral system, for example, it's a world where the people in power can change the rules by which they are hired in ways that can be to their advantage, whether it's to maximize partisan goals or to protect incumbents. It's an issue that I think, not specific to Japan, of course, these problems were seen as endemic in other countries, but I think the survival of constitutions, the ability of constitutions to protect democratic principles has increasingly come under attack. From about 10 years ago, I think there were increasing worries about Hungary. as a case of democratic backsliding, which in itself is a big topic in political science. Poland and the attempts of the current government to reverse reforms to the judiciary, which were seen as making the courts too pliant with the government. South Korea more recently, the ability of the president to declare martial law and ways to control it, I think, has come under a lot of attention. But of course, it has also become an American problem. And you go to any news channel over the last month or so, and we see questions like, well, first of all, are we in a constitutional crisis? What is a constitutional crisis? And some would argue that, and some scholars already argue that the country is in a constitutional crisis. The question is how to think about constitutional crises. What does it mean for a constitution to last? And the standard way that I think this has been described in political science is that constitutions exist as a pact to enable the consolidation of the rule of law. So there are a number of reasons why democracy or majority rule by itself may be insufficient to protect democratic norms or rule of law. One is that there may be disagreements about what is considered a violation of existing practices. Melissa Schwartzberg, a political theorist at NYU, uses a term that I like, democratic autophagy. Autophagy is effectively when an organism eats or consumes itself. And the concern with majority rule is that the majority may implement laws that are detrimental to minority groups. And so constitutional pacts have been argued to be solution to these two problems. First, by having a written constitution, it more clearly enumerates what the limits of the government are. What are the rights and duties of the government, and how does the government make decisions? So the clear enumeration should simplify the monitoring by citizens of what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, which should allow for the rule of law to survive. The second, which is more concerned with deterring tyranny of the majority, is erecting higher, generally supermajoritarian hurdles to amending core principles in the Constitution so that 51% cannot simply pass laws to take away the rights or wealth of the 49%. Now the question, at least at the empirical level, is what allows these constitutional pacts to survive over time, or constitutional endurance. And endurance in this sense is both longevity of the Constitution itself, but also the fact that the Constitution is working, that people are abiding by what's in it. And there have, at least at the theoretical level, been arguments that this depends on the legitimacy of the Constitution. Now, legitimacy is like leadership or teamwork. Like these are concepts that we know exist. We think we know it when we see it, but it's also very difficult to explicitly identify how to measure it. And so it's a concept that I've stayed away actually from a lot of my career, but I've become much more interested in it. But at least the theoretical concept is a constitution is legitimate if citizens are willing to punish deviations. And constitutional survival and constitutional endurance has been probably studied the most by legal scholars. And one concern has been this question, or the point that I noted earlier, which is periodic amendments are seen as necessary for constitutional survival. But there is also a worry that some amendments may go too far. That, for example, constitutional scholars, Gary Jacobson, Richard Albert, have argued that there is a core, an identity to a constitution. In Japan, sometimes this is described as pacifism, in Article 9, or popular sovereignty, respect for fundamental human rights. Amendments that go beyond, either through reinterpretation or formal changes, can be seen as breaking the core of the Constitution in a way that is problematic, leading to related arguments that some amendments or some principles of the Constitution should be unamendable. Some things cannot be changed. Put differently, the concern with amendability has been that of excessive amendment. We know amendments are necessary. Excessive amendments are bad. But this leaves the question, especially for the Constitution of Japan, of whether perennial unamendment is harmful to legitimacy. And so the working definition that I'll use today, and hopefully I can show some data to illuminate what I mean by it, is a constitution is legitimate if citizens prioritize adherence over other interests, whether that's self-interest or partisanship. That means that there should be a broad social acceptance of what the Constitution enumerates in the text, but also how it's interpreted. And second, a willingness to punish violations, even if those violations may be in your interest, or the violation or the violator is somebody that you support on partisan, ethnic, or other grounds. Where does the Constitution of Japan sit in this spectrum? Again, it's the oldest unamended constitution in the world, but public opinion towards preserving it in exactly its current form has long been a partisan sticking point. This figure shows data from the Yomiuri, the largest, center-right but largest daily newspaper in Japan that has been doing annual polls since 1991, asking people, are you in favor of amending the Constitution or not? It's a slightly odd question, right? Because if I asked most of you, are you in favor of amending the American Constitution, you would probably say, well, it depends a lot on what you want to amend. In Japan, I think there's been a sense that any question about amendment relates to the Article 9 prohibition on Japan having military force. But as this figure shows, support and opposition have fluctuated over time, but society in general has been relatively evenly divided, with support in blue, opposition in red, with support a little bit higher in recent years. And public opinion matters in Japan, not just because we think democratic governments should follow citizens' will. So Japan is one of about 50% of constitutions in the world that require majority approval in a national referendum. So public opinion directly impacts the content of the Constitution. So understanding how Japanese people think about the document is of crucial importance to its future. The debate has been particularly heated at the elite level. The long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party published comprehensive drafts to revise the Constitution in 2005 and 2012. These are article-by-article complete reconfigurations of the Constitution. In 2017, they focused on 4 concrete priorities. I'll come back to these a little bit later. On the left is a picture of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe speaking at an online forum for pro-constitutional amendment groups, saying it's finally time to amend the Constitution. On the right is a picture of current Prime Minister Ishiba and the LDP's election manifesto from 2024, which has historically included a chapter devoted to the importance of amending the Constitution in partnership with the people. This is another picture of former Prime Minister Kishida speaking at a different convention relating to constitutional revision. But it's not just a pro-amendment side that is heated. On the anti-amendment, or certainly groups that are hesitant toward any changes, in particular to Article 9, have had demonstrations in public saying that comprehensive changes to the core principles is a violation and will make the Constitution worse. So that was a very long wind-up to what I want to talk about today, which is research I've been doing and a book project I'm working on with my colleague, or my longtime co-author, Chris Winkler, about consolidating constitutional democracy. Elite debate in Japan has hardened into fairly strident pro- and anti-amendment camps. But are there ways to amend the Constitution to improve civic legitimacy in a way that the Constitution actually becomes more entrenched, becomes more viable? And we focus on 2 different elements of legitimacy that have some overlapping components. One is something that I think legal scholars think about the most, which is a legal or procedural element to a constitution. Was it ratified according to the existing guidelines on how constitutions should change? Are amendments following the principles as outlined in the current constitution? Is the political process of constitutional amendment seen as valid? So this is the how of constitutional change. The second is, I think, a more political science question. It's the substance of the Constitution. Is what is promised in the Constitution in accordance with the preferred content of the public? And so what I'll show you primarily today is a quick overview of some other work I've done that speaks to this literature, as well as sharing some public opinion data on how we're trying to measure this concept of legitimacy. And where I'll end up is hopefully, I don't know how convincing it will be, but to show that there seems to be a strong desire for a multi-partisan or non-partisan constitutional amendment process which yields a greater enumeration of new rights that are not in the current Constitution, particularly rights to privacy and to environmental rights. However, there also appears to be a tolerance for reinterpretations to the Constitution once they're enacted, even though the same changes done through a formal amendment would be unpopular. Okay. Many of you know some things about the Constitution. I think many of you aren't specialists in this. So to give you, I'm going to do some violence to post-war constitutional history in Japan. But the post-war Constitution replaced the former imperial constitution of Japan, sometimes called the Meiji Constitution, which was originally ratified in 1889. After the conclusion of World War II, domestic sovereignty was limited, and the Japanese government was more or less run by the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, Douglas MacArthur, the beginning of the Allied occupation of Japan. Originally, Japanese elites who had not been purged after World War II were left in charge of drafting a new constitution, but the Allied forces believed that the Japanese were dragging their feet too much, and so under the guidance of the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers and the general headquarters, the GHQ of the occupation, a new constitutional draft was written up in a little over a week. This was then ratified after debate in the Japanese Diet, Japan's parliament, on November 3rd, 1946, as a wholesale amendment to the preceding Meiji Constitution, and it comes into effect in 1947. I found this great picture of kamishibai. What's kamishibai in English? Like picture shows of people trying to explain to citizens, like, what exactly does a new constitution mean, and what does popular sovereignty mean, and so on. So there's a multi-year process of teaching what the new system is supposed to be. The founding of the Constitution itself has come under accusations of illegitimacy. The main argument against the legitimacy of the new Constitution is that, first, it was ratified when Japanese sovereignty was limited, and the amendment to create the new Constitution of Japan exceeded the parameters of what would be considered an acceptable amendment to the Meiji Constitution. In particular, it replaced imperial sovereignty with popular sovereignty, and this was seen as too much for a legitimate constitutional amendment. The second, a more political argument, was the sense, or certainly the threat, that the Allied occupation would not begin until a new constitution was ratified. And that put a lot of pressure to craft a new constitution as quickly as possible, even though there may not be broad civic agreement on what its contents should be. This argument has been around since early after the end of World War II. I'd say most constitutional scholars would argue that these arguments are not without merit, but are outweighed by arguments in favor of the legitimacy of the new constitution. The first is that the Japanese government signed the Potsdam Declaration, which ended, which are the conditions of surrender of Japan after World War II, which included Article 9, which writes that the Japanese government shall remove all obstacles to the revival, strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people. In effect, the Japanese government agreed to give up imperial sovereignty for popular sovereignty. The second is that the new constitution was debated and ratified in a democratically elected diet. And so if we believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God, then it has the legitimacy necessary to proceed. I've done, and this part of the book is more Chris Winkler's section, but the sense that the Constitution has been imposed, in Japanese it's often called the oshitsukero. It's a force upon the Japanese by American or Allied powers, has long existed in Japanese public opinion as well, but it's become less salient over time. This is the same Yomiuri survey that I showed a few slides ago, but it shows the reasons why people are in favor or opposed to constitutional change. So this is the share of all respondents who say, for example, that yes, we should amend the Constitution because it was imposed, which is shown with a black line. Those who want constitutional change because the current Constitution is causing too much confusion, too much reinterpretation, we don't know what it means. Shown in red, and in blue is, yes, we need to revise the Constitution to strengthen Japan's self-defense capacities. The three lines moved in tandem, or at least many respondents shared many of these opinions in common through the 90s and early 2000s. But as you can see in recent years, those who believe in the imposed argument has fallen. And a greater concern is that the Constitution is causing confusion. We don't know what it can really limit or not. So the ratification argument is there. I think the public has moved on. And the greater question today is about the degree of amendment that is desirable and how it should be attained. The Liberal Democratic Party and conservatives have often argued that changing the Constitution of Japan is too difficult. It requires 2/3 in both chambers of the Japanese Diet, Japan's parliament, followed by a simple majority in a national referendum. And the main criticism has been on the 2/3 component in the Diet. This is, again, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, when the LDP returned to power in 2012, made amending Article 96, which defines the amendment procedure, the first hurdle, saying it's unfair that a minority of 1/3 can block something that 2/3 of the population would want. I have mixed feelings about this argument, primarily because constitutions are almost by design supposed to be counter-majoritarian. They are supposed to be harder to change than normal legislation. But if we look at comparative data, we also see that the Article 96 procedure is actually quite common globally. If you look at all constitutions in the world today, just 6% have a majority hurdle that allow amendments, at least in parliament, by a half. Some countries use 3/5. 11% of constitutions require 3/4. But the most common way to get parliamentary approval for constitutional change is 2/3, which is used by 78% of constitutions. And about half of those have a referendum provision as well. So the Article 96 combination is used in 35% of constitutions around the world. It is quite common. So the argument that the COJ is uncommonly rigid, I think, doesn't hold. In a separate paper with former students of mine, Shusei Esima, Ai Takahashi, also Chris Winkler, we also look at public opinion towards constitutional change. There are people who want to lower the Diet hurdle. About 36% of respondents in our survey want to lower the hurdle. But a majority, a bare majority, but yet a majority, are fine with the status quo system. So it doesn't seem like there's a strong impetus to change the amendment process itself. But there is a separate political argument. The Constitution is unamended. Opinion is divided on how to amend the Constitution. But in a survey done by the Asahi, Japan's second largest daily newspaper, in 2024, asked, the LDP has proposed that they begin drafting specific amendments this year. Do you support moving forward with drafting specific amendments? 59% say yes. So there is a hunger for at least deliberation of constitutional change. One thing that has impeded it is that the priorities of the right and the left have actually diverged, at the elite level, at least. For example, one of the LDP's priorities is amending Article 9 to formally enumerate self-defense capacity by writing in, there are actually various versions of this as well, but saying that even though Japan forgoes military potential, it has a right to self-defense. On the left, the concerns are more about political institutions. The LDP keeps on calling snap elections whenever it's in their benefit and favorable to their electoral prospects, and so there should be limitations on when the House of Representatives, the lower house, can be dissolved. Understandably, this makes it hard to form compromise because you're coming from very different political priorities and ideological preferences. But one thing that's actually been quite interesting in recent years is growing debate about the need to establish national emergency provisions. About 90% of constitutions in the world have some kind of state of emergency rules. These are conditions under which existing human rights or duties can be temporarily weakened, and oftentimes the government is given more authority to enact legislation without the normal checks and balances that would be required. But the impetus to move forward with the state of emergency tends to grow, and this is a global phenomenon, tends to grow during natural disasters. So in Japan, there was an initial spike after the triple disaster, the tsunami, earthquake, tsunami, nuclear meltdown in 2011, and it of course became a salient issue during COVID since 2020. Measures to move forward with establishing state of emergency is actually backed by a kind of multi-partisan coalition of political parties. So not only the Liberal Democratic Party, but its coalition partner Komeito, center-right opposition party called Nippon Ishin, sometimes translated as Japan Innovation Party, and the Democratic Party for the People. There's a picture of all these kind of, in the middle are Ishin and DPP, but opposition parties are sharing and signing an agreement to move forward with this amendment. This political process, I would argue, is important and represents a new front in amendment debate in Japan. Because in earlier work with Shusei Eshima and Chris Winkler, one thing we find is that when voters are uncertain about the merits of constitutional change, they use the identity of the proposer to judge the quality and merit of the proposal. So in the survey experiment we conducted, what we do is we show respondents 12 different constitutional amendment proposals that are taken word for word from the LDP's 2012 proposal. We simply change who the proposer is. Half the respondents randomly are told it's an LDP proposal. The other half are told it's by a panel of independent experts. And what we find is when it's described as a neutral proposal, it does not convince LDP voters at all, but it has a strong effect on independents and opposition party supporters. On state of emergency provisions in particular, we find that there's an 8% increase among independents and almost a 10% increase among opposition partisans when the same proposal is described as nonpartisan than LDP driven. So the takeaway, at least from the procedural element of constitutional legitimacy, is, and what we know from Japan, is one, there is a desire for greater discussion about constitutional change, and the second is elite cues matter. How elites debate and how they form coalitions on moving forward with constitutional change will affect the degree to which it will be accepted by the public. The second element of constitutional legitimacy is with its substance, is what is promised in the Constitution in accordance with what voters, citizens, consider to be ideal, how they want the state to be. In my book, I argue that the structural need for amendment is not very great in Japan because many things can be changed by law. But of course, not needing amendment and not wanting amendment are different. A constitution that has worked well for 75 years may not necessarily be best suited for the next 75. And so with varying colleagues, I've been doing a series of surveys on public attitudes towards the substance of constitutional change. And with, in particular, a focus on what are the kind of changes that attract broad approval that does not divide on partisan lines. Now, there have been multiple arguments about the illegitimacy of the Constitution of Japan on substance grounds, not on procedural grounds. The Liberal Democratic Party, in its founding charter in 1955, writes that the democracy and liberalism imposed by the occupation should be respected and upheld as leading principles of the new Japan. So the principles are good. However, because the occupation's policies were oriented principally toward weakening Japan, many of the reforms wrongly suppressed respect for the state and patriotism and unduly fragmented and weakened the power of the state. And Chris Winkler, in tracing 40 years of different constitutional amendment proposals by political parties as well as intellectuals and media companies, have noted that there are three broad arguments about the illegitimacy of the Constitution in a substantive sense. One is that it's insufficiently Japanese. it talks about grand principles like democracy and liberalism and peace, but it looks almost like a template that doesn't speak to Japanese culture. Second, by prioritizing fundamental human rights and the irrevocability of human rights, it downplays civic duties and weakens patriotism. And third, as an unamended constitution, it must have become outdated globally. There are a lot of different arguments about this, but this is, I think Yuki Shiraito showed a picture of the Gokoku Shrine cats. This is a different Gokoku Shrine in Miyagi. So it's a Shinto shrine in Sendai. I went there for a conference. On the left is a statue to the famous warlord, Date Masamune. But at this Miyagi Gokoku Jinja, I know it's all in Japanese. So at the top is, let us all pray to the gods and thank them for prosperity and peace. But at the bottom here, it says, it is time for us to create a beautiful constitution for Japan as quickly as possible. So it's an overtly political message. And it speaks to, especially among conservative circles, the fact that the constitution is not sufficiently Japanese. I'm generally hesitant, or generally don't agree with many of these arguments. On a structural level, and I noted these before, first, the Constitution as a text has not changed, but there have been many incremental changes that have occurred over time. And there are varying arguments that maybe shorter constitutions are better, incremental changes are better. George Sabellis has argued this in varying forms, although I hate to take your central arguments. But the second is, empirically, if we look at the content of the Constitution of Japan, it is actually in line with global standards. As in newer constitutions that are ratified more recently, resemble the Constitution of Japan in terms of its content more than older constitutions do. We also know from public opinion that, broadly speaking, what's in the COJ is what people like. So in a paper in the Journal of International Journal of Constitutional Law, we use an experimental form called the conjoint experiment to ask people what they consider to be ideal in, what they would like in an ideal constitution. Not necessarily what they want in the Constitution of Japan. What do they want in an ideal constitution? And we find overwhelming support for enumerating new rights, again, to the environment, to privacy, to government transparency. In a paper with Yuki Shiraito and Saki Kuzushima, who did her doctorate here at the University of Michigan, now a postdoc at Harvard, we also find that people believe that adhering to the Constitution is important. This is from the Review of International Organizations, and we find that when people are told that some Japanese status quo practices, like requiring same surname upon marriage, or having very weak restrictions on hate speech, go against Japan's international law commitments, it doesn't really change their mind. But if we tell them that the Constitution requires that domestic law be in compliance with international law, it moves public opinion. So there is a legitimacy to using the Constitution as a way to change public opinion. But broadly speaking, what are these changes that people want? The political process suggests that talking about constitutional change can provoke partisan conflict. And my colleague at the law faculty at the University of Tokyo, Masaki Taniguchi, uses decades of survey data to show that the best predictor of if you're left-wing or right-wing, more likely to vote for the LDP or an opposition party, is your attitude towards constitutional change. I suppose it's like Second Amendment rights or maybe abortion rights in the United States. It's not that people inherently care about the Constitution, more that it overlaps with a lot of other partisan conflicts, particularly about foreign and security policy. So moving forward with a constitutional amendment that only gets support from one side of the political spectrum risks poor adherence, meaning you may not punish violations of the Constitution if you yourself are in agreement, or you personally think that that provision is good or bad. And so we've been doing surveys asking about people's attitudes towards left-wing priorities, so limiting Prime Minister's ability to dissolve the lower house, adding new rights to environment, privacy, government transparency. On the right, it's amending Article 9 to enumerate the self-defense forces and adding state of emergency. And I'll show you the headline result. This is a survey from March 2024. It arrays the rights by their overall level of support, which is shown on the first column. I've also divided it by support among those who are LDP partisans. So LDP partisans are 18% of our survey, as opposed to everybody else. We can break this down in other ways too, but everybody else. And then the difference between the two. If it's shaded in green, it means that a majority of that subgroup are in favor. What we see is on privacy rights and on environmental rights, both LDP and opposition partisans are in favor. And the difference between them is minimal. On the other hand, enumerating the self-defense forces or state of emergency, or sorry, empowering the prime minister during state of emergency is highly popular among LDP partisans, but deeply mistrusted by everybody else, as we see about a 20 to 25% gap in approval of these changes. There's very little support for restricting the prime minister's dissolution powers. We've done this in other forums. We've done multi-panel surveys that look at changes in people's opinion over time. But what we broadly find, again, is first, even though there's an elite partisan divide on substance, second, we do think there is fairly stable cross-partisan support for adding new rights. So if you were to amend the Constitution, the procedural argument is do it in a nonpartisan way. And the second is focus on adding new rights. Do not pick divisive issues. What we've become more concerned about, and what we're working on the most today, is not formal amendments to the Constitution. Instead, it's about radical reinterpretation. Studying the formal Constitution and doing it in a comparative perspective is easier to do because there is a constitutional text. And we can code it, we can measure it, we can analyze it. But interpretation is a little bit more difficult. It requires understanding of case law. It also depends on who's doing the interpreting. Is it the government? Is it the courts? And what we see in other countries, and certainly is valid in the United States, is if it becomes too difficult to formally amend the Constitution in a way that accords with your priorities, governments will try to push through reinterpretations. The question is whether or not something that is likely to fail through a formal amendment, if done informally, will be equally disliked or will come to be accepted. We look at Article 9. So I've shown the text in passing, but Article 9 has two clauses. The first states that the Japanese people renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. The second is, in order to accomplish these aims, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of aggression of the state will not be recognized. And so the most divisive issue, the first clause is kind of a long-term goal. We won't go to war. We'll be good neighbors. The second is a more contested issue, especially about what it means to maintain war potential. The standing interpretation and the primary body entrusted with interpreting the Constitution in a legal sense is a Cabinet Legislation Bureau. But I would say this is an argument that most constitutional scholars in Japan would agree with. The traditional interpretation has been that while Article 9 says you cannot have a military or war potential, other elements of the Constitution, the preamble writes that Japanese people have the right to live in peace. Article 13 writes that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't protect your people if you don't have any military force. And therefore, certain minimal levels, minimal necessary levels of self-defense should be permitted, and we should not consider to be war potential. And in a way, the debates that have proceeded over for much of the post-war period is what does minimum necessary level mean? But this came to the fore in 2014 and 2015, when under the second Abe cabinet, the Cabinet Legislation Bureau changed a core principle that it espoused till then, which is to permit a limited form of collective self-defense. Instead of the self-defense forces being limited to protecting Japanese territory, through reinterpretation in 2014 and new security legislation passed in 2015, now the use of force to prevent an armed attack on a close foreign partner was to be allowed, even if Japan itself is not directly attacked. And the legislation writes that when there's no other means to repel attack on a close partner, doesn't have to be a formal ally, but on a country that Japan relies on and strong relations with, the self-defense forces can be dispatched. This drew some of the biggest protests in post-war Japan. On the left is a picture of the Diet at the bottom, and people lined up. There were speeches, demonstrations that happened all through the day and night. But one thing that my colleagues and I found is, as unpopular as this reinterpretation and new legislation was, public opinion seems to have moved to accept the change fairly quickly. So in September 2015, when the security legislation was passed, 51% said they thought collective self-defense was unconstitutional. Only 22% said it's constitutional, it's okay. But the numbers gradually shift. The percentage saying, no, we don't think it's unconstitutional, crept up, and by March of 2017, so 2 years later, a year and a half later, more people say no than yes, meaning more people say that they don't think it's a violation of the Constitution. And we think there are two interpretations. They're related concepts. First is there is a status quo bias. That exists, I think, across populations, arguably stronger in Japan. But people don't want change, especially to settled principles. What that also means, though, is if you force through a change, now we have a new status quo. And that new status quo is something people want to accept and establish as the new baseline. So if it's done, it must be constitutional, or let's just say it's constitutional and move on. So with a different colleague at the law faculty, Shiro Sakaya, and a friend at Kobe University, Yosuke Shinohara, we've been trying to understand status quo biases through survey experiments in Japan. And we want to know three things. First, how much motivated reasoning is there? It's possible that people have preferences about a policy, and they will automatically think, if I like this policy, it must be constitutional. The second is whether or not people's partisanship, which party they support, influences beliefs about the constitutionality. So if it's a change that's proposed by a party that I like, then I will not only like the policy, I will also assume it is constitutional. And the third is whether this is subject to status quo bias. And the way we try to measure this is threefold. One, we ask about policy preference and beliefs about constitutionality separately. Then we show people whether or not these policies have already been adopted or not. Some have been adopted, some have not. And the third is a more minor point. We show people the text of Article 9 and see if they agree. So this is what it looks like. So we first ask respondents, do you think Japan should adopt the following policy measures? And we explicitly say you do not need to consider their permissibility under the current constitution. So we asked some policies that have arguably been settled or Japan has adopted for a long time, like alliance with the United States, maintaining self-defense forces, SDF participation in UN peacekeeping operations, limited collective self-defense. That's what was passed in the 2015 legislation. Possession of counter-strike capabilities, such as attacking enemy bases preemptively, export weapons with lethal capabilities, full collective self-defense, where even if Japan's survival is not at stake, Japan could come to the defense of partner states, possessing nuclear weapons, and a military draft, conscription. So we ask people, what do you think about these policies? Then we ask about constitutionality. Regardless of what you think about them as policies, do you believe that these are permissible under the current constitution? So the core thing we want to know is the gap between the two and whether that gap can be shrunk or expanded. Our key treatment is showing people whether or not this is the status quo or not. So to 1/3 of the respondents, so 1/3 is just asked, or sorry, 1/4 is asked, what do you think about constitutionality? 1/4 is randomly asked with the additional text in red. For policy measures that have already been implemented, the timing of their introduction is also indicated. So everything up to 6 has been a reinterpreted change to the capability of the Japanese government, including exporting lethal weapons and possession of counter-strike capabilities. Another quarter is shown the text of Article 9, and another quarter is shown the combination of the two treatments, the text of Article 9 and what years these policies were adopted, if ever. Let me walk you through the results. The left panel shows the percentage who support these measures as a policy. The right panel shows a proportion that supports its constitutionality. I won't go through each one, but there are sort of three broad categories. On US-Japan alliance, having the self-defense forces and peacekeeping operations, there is very strong support. About 3/4 or more support it both as a policy as well as its constitutionality. Within these figures, on the right are those that are more unpopular. For example, conscription is only supported by 14%, and only 11% think it's constitutional. Nuclear weapons is also highly disliked, and full collective self-defense. The policy gets 46% support, but only 29% think it's constitutional. But the action is really in limited collective self-defense, which is passed in 2015, and counter-strike capabilities, which is the purple line, where 70% think it's a good policy, but only 41% think it's constitutional. So there's no evidence that there's automatic motivated reasoning. People do separate, on some issues at least, a difference between the two. This shows the difference between those two lines. So it clarifies to some extent. The biggest gap between policy preference and constitutionality is on counter-strike, then on limited collective self-defense, and then full collective self-defense. But on most measures, those who think, so positive value means more people prefer it than believe it's constitutional. On most things, there is some gap. We can also look at this across partisanship. I'll just show you the difference figure. So here, the right panel is those who support the LDP. The left panel is those who support non-LDP parties. Interestingly, the gap between policy preference and constitutionality is much greater among LDP supporters. Which is to say, LDP supporters really like these policies, including, for example, counter-strike and limited collective self-defense, but a large fraction of them are aware that it's unconstitutional. This is not a bad thing for constitutional adherence, right? We want people to support a defense of the Constitution or adherence to the Constitution, even if they disagree with the policy that's in it. But here's the status quo bias, or sorry, the results of our experiment. So this is a simple analysis. We simply show the change in support for the policy, or sorry, change in belief about the constitutionality of these 9 policies when they are shown different kinds of information. So compared to the control group that is shown no particular information, we have those who are shown the text of Article 9, those who are shown the year of implementation, and then those who are shown both. So within each figure, so next to the label, for example, with US Alliance, it says 0.85. That's a proportion in the control group who support the policy. So we want to know how many more people support it or not support it when they're shown different information. And the key thing I want to focus on is the year treatment. Again, that's the year of implementation. What we see, for example, with those in the middle category, those that are more contentious, on limited collective self-defense, baseline support is 51%. People who are shown that it has already been implemented and came into force in 2015 are about 9% more likely to believe in its constitutionality than those who are shown no information. On counter-strike, belief in the constitutionality goes up by 11%. On exporting lethal weapons, it's about 7 or 8%. Article 9 text itself does not have a statistically significant effect. We've also looked at subgroup differences. So here I've just extracted the year treatment effect for the 9 different policies. We see again that the movement to the right, the proportion change in support for the policy when shown the year of implementation is greatest on limited collective self-defense, counter-strike, export lethal weapons. The effect of this information is greater among certain subgroups. For example, younger respondents are influenced by this information more than older respondents. Those who are less knowledgeable about the Constitution, we have a kind of a small quiz that asks people how much they know about the Constitution. Those who are less knowledgeable are influenced more. And we ask people how risk averse they are. People who are risk averse actually are influenced by this information more. Interestingly, there's no difference by partisan identification. The effect of showing this information is no difference whether you're an LDP supporter or not. So this suggests a fairly stable information effect, which from different perspectives can be a good or bad thing. But there seems to be acceptance of informal changes on contentious issues like Article 9, even if, and among voters who are opposed to formal amendments. Let me wrap up. So consolidating constitutional democracy, sort of the big theme that Chris and I have been working on. Our argument is that constitutional entrenchment, the fact that the Constitution survives and constrains the government in the ways that it's conceived to, depends on the values citizens place on adherence, and especially adherence over other priorities. We try to measure legitimacy on procedural grounds. We find that there's opposition to amendment initiatives that are only backed by one end of the political spectrum. On substance, we find that there is broad support for adding more rights, but not on Article 9 or state of emergency. And finally, with the caveat that contentious interpretive changes, once adopted, become the new normal. What we don't know and what we hope to study more going forward is whether or not these interpretive changes weaken the entrenchment of the Constitution. Do they weaken people's respect for or veneration of the supreme law? Now, the LDP is aware that many of the changes they want to enact are unpopular or contentious. One thing they've done over the last 15 years or so is they published a lot of manga. So the manga on the left came out in 2012 at the same time as their Constitution draft. And it's about 60, 70 pages long. It's quite entertaining, actually. And it's titled, What Does Constitutional Revision Mean? And so the main character is a mother with her baby son. She has her husband who does very little in the manga. And there's a lot of mansplaining that's done by the two grandfathers. More recently, the LDP published a manga. So what does it mean to enumerate the self-defense forces in the Constitution? It's like the worst title for light reading, I think. So it's still a mother. Husband is more useful this time. And now it's only one set of grandparents who are there. But thankfully, the grandmother is there this time as well. And convincing the public to accept contentious changes is something governments do. And it's a legitimate thing they should do. I have a separate little spiel about democratic backsliding that I won't go into today, but I think questions about the degree to which Constitution is defending democracy is increasingly in doubt. And I say this knowing that there is contention on how much democratic backsliding there is, but this is data from Varieties of Democracy, VDEM. And what they find is, in green is a number of countries that are democratizing, in red are the countries that are autocratizing. In recent years, it seems that fewer countries are becoming democratic, more are becoming autocratic. And again, this is a contentious argument, and we can measure it different ways. But I think constitutions are critical to defending democracy. So the picture on the right is an Ouroboros. It's from Norse legend, but also from others. It's a snake that eats its own tail. This one is eating a constitution. I made this on ChatGPT. It took about 10 minutes. But to preserve legitimacy, or at least what I would take away from this talk in the Japanese context, preserve legitimacy, I think it's crucial to remove any debate about changes from partisan conflict. What that also means is reflexive opposition to any constitutional change can harm the Constitution's legitimacy, given that there is broad bipartisan support for adding new rights to the Constitution. My advice, and when I talk to political parties, I say this: you need to diversify who has voice. You also need to diversify the substantive menu. But the question that remains, and this is partially a more, not quite an activist thing to do, but the thing that Chris and I have been debating how we should engage is, well, how do you actually deepen debate, right? Yelling at the left that they're not taking right-wing priorities or yelling at the right that they're not taking left-wing priorities it feels nice to do, but it is not a concrete political step forward. So what does it mean to actually deepen debate? And also thinking more carefully about the nature of interpretation, whether does a government reinterpretation have the same value as a Supreme Court reinterpretation, for example. These are long issues that we'll continue to engage with over the next couple of years. But thank you for your patience. I think I went a little bit over, and I appreciate any feedback you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. And, the floor is open. If you have any questions, please raise your hand.
It's showing that screen. So I was wondering, maybe that works. One and two. Okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question about how to improve civic legitimacy. Do you have any suggestion about a little bit specific proposal or suggestion how we can improve current way of amendment? And also I have another question that is it possible to remove partisan debate, because politicians are elected through election and they have to care about a lot of interests of supporters, and I think it is very natural for them to follow the interests.
Right.
So these are my questions.
Thank you very much. That is something that so I've been working on, not quite as a side project, but one thing that is true about constitutional amendment procedures in many countries is that it is elite-driven, meaning the amendment content is drafted in Parliament, and voters have an up or down vote, but they are not directly involved in crafting the constitutional change itself. Now, there are exceptions. For example, in the US, there's an option to go through state conventions, but many and other countries allow for citizens to put issues on a ballot. But one, I think, important case is not quite crowdsourcing, but a lotocracy approach. I'm speaking specifically about Ireland's adoption of a constituent assembly or citizens' assembly, where they randomly select 50 men, 50 women from society and do a one-year study group where they discuss which elements of the Constitution are problematic, which elements are good, and write concrete suggestions to put on the parliamentary agenda. This actually has spurred a lot of constitutional amendments in Ireland as well. So issues that elites didn't care about. So there are contentious issues like the right to abortion was newly enumerated in the Constitution a few years ago. But there was also an obsolete article in the Constitution that criminalizes blasphemy. Right? It's a Catholic. I'm from Ireland originally, which is partially why I'm interested in the case. But so there's a broader menu that can arise if, I think, citizens are more directly involved in the drafting of the process. And so I've been working actually with some political parties as well as constitutional scholars on whether or not it's possible to do something similar in Japan. Now, the Citizens' Assembly cannot mandate in Ireland that it go to a parliamentary vote. But there is strong democratic pressure, which makes it hard for the government to refuse to put it on the agenda. So I think that is one concrete way to remove the partisan debate. But this is a multi-year process. And I know some constitutional scholars believe that, while it's nice from a democratic perspective, it may be problematic to have anything initiated from outside the Diet. So, yes. But thank you very much for your question. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think there's one question first, and then.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Very nice.
Thank you.
You mentioned that in Japan, when they talk about amending the constitution or anything with that topic, people think of Article 9. Just out of curiosity, is there other like hot topics per se in Japan, kind of related to just worldwide, things like that? In America, as you mentioned, we have like, abortion and things like that, where people are constantly going back and forth on what should be. I'm just interested in Japan. Are there things other than Article 9 that might be big topics? Thank you.
So let me show you some. Well, I'm going to show you a slide that I think I showed briefly earlier. Actually, let me show you a different version of the slide. So we do observe year-to-year fluctuation in what issues people care about. And things like state of emergency, which is subject to natural disasters, is a very paradigmatic case of that. And so my colleagues at the Institute of Social Science and I were actually doing a multi-wave survey on COVID. So over 4 periods of time, we asked the same respondents on their attitudes towards COVID measures, but I insisted that they include questions about the Constitution, as well as what political parties they support, who they would vote for. And 2 of these surveys coincided with a lower house election in 2021 and an upper house election in 2022. I'm going to show you 2 things. The first is who actually cares about constitutional amendment. So in these multiple periods, we asked people who you would vote for, but we also asked what are the top 3 issues that will determine who you're going to vote for. So it's about policy priority or policy salience. So what this figure shows is the distribution of respondents on a left to right ideological scale. So 0 means very left wing, 10 means very right wing. The distribution of respondents who say that in red, they never include the Constitution as something they care about. And in blue, those who, at least in 3 of the surveys, said, we care about the Constitution. What we find is most people, so in the red category, they never care about the Constitution. Most people identify themselves in the middle of the ideological spectrum. The people who care the most, who say they always care, are more clustered in the right wing of the spectrum. So this is an issue, at least in the period that we're looking at, has greater salience among probably pro-LDP politicians than opposition politicians. But we also asked for consistent support for constitutional amendment provisions. So this is a variant of the slide that I showed you earlier. And we've broken up the percentage who say they always vote for the LDP, always vote for the Constitutional Democratic Party, the main center-left, for Ishin, JCP, who said, I am in favor of amending the Constitution all 3 times that we asked them. So it is consistent support among consistent partisans. On environmental rights and on adding new privacy rights. Now, this really needs to be fleshed out, especially privacy rights, which is probably the hottest topic in Japanese constitutional law. The right of, it's really related to digital rights, anonymity on the internet, and so on. What we find on, for example, privacy rights is 59% of LDP voters say they support this all the time. 62% Constitutional Democratic Party, 63% of Ishin. On environmental rights, probably the most anti-constitutional amendment party, the Japan Communist Party. On the far right, 52% are in favor. So I think these are topics that can become both nonpartisan, like the first question, I think also viable as a serious amendment measure. What we don't actually know, though, and what we're hoping to do further tests on, is we're asking people, do you think you should have the right to live in a clean environment and that should be in the Constitution? They will say yes. It's not clear how much people think about the trade-offs, what that will do for economic development. Also, there's a whole array of environmental rights. It's the right of people to live in an environment, but do animals themselves have rights? Or do natural resources have rights? So these are things where the opinion may change as we go into greater debate. But given that there isn't very much debate, I think these are things that can become important issues.
Yeah, I wanted to
I think you might need a microphone for the internet crowd.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your concept of legitimacy. I would, in principle, think about institutional realism, given the constraints for amending the Constitution, anything that does not get 2/3, we are wasting our time, which is exactly what the centrist people say, okay, that I never care about it because, I mean, that would be my interpretation. And I don't know how you could discriminate between the two. But in my mind, the legitimacy is not working, and the constitutional realism or institutional realism is really a very clear shortcut that, introduces all the human rights and the extensions, et cetera, that have the support, and drops all the things that are to the left or to the right.
So one thing, one benefit of a super or counter-majoritarian constitution that has supermajority requirements is this idea that it takes the issue out of regular political debate. Right? There's no point in arguing about it because it's not going to be changeable. I think that's the world where the reinterpretation becomes the trickier issue and something that I'm trying to get a better sense of. But at least in the Japanese context, it's hard to find any issue on which there is going to be 2/3 support that wins left and right-wing support. State of emergency might be an exception, but that's also a world where the devil's in the details, right? Should the government have more power during emergencies? Sure. What kind of emergencies are we talking about, right? Natural disasters, foreign invasion, yes. Internal disorder becomes a little bit more contentious. So there's a way in which I think many ideas have broad support, but it's going to be hard to write any concrete text to make the amendment, which is what gives rise to the interpretive pathway that I have concerns about legitimacy, except it turns out that most voters are okay with it, so maybe it is legitimate. But then what the legitimacy of the formal text itself, like what still remains and how important that is something I haven't quite figured out. I'm not answering your question very directly, but
let me give you an example. The Mexican Constitution is extremely formally strict. It requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and a half of the states. Some people say that it looks like the American Constitution. What has happened is that the Mexicans make more than 10 amendments every year. One of the reasons that they do it is because the three major parties have agreed to be together. And so the fact that it appears to be three parties doesn't matter. There is a unanimity. Right. Thought experiment. If the right and the left could say, I trade you one kind of amendment towards the other, wouldn't it be a very feasible way to amend the Constitution in both ways?
So this kind of log rolling is something that the LDP has talked to opposition parties about initiating. I think one thing that is probably complicating, and this is something I don't know very much about amendment procedures, is in Japan, there cannot be a package vote. Every vote has to be, every change to the Constitution has to be about one issue only. So you can't, at least as a simultaneous package, do Article 9 and environmental rights. So I think the elites can negotiate this, right? Political parties can form relatively credible bargains. I think many parties are concerned that their voters will not follow suit. Their voters will only support the ones that they like, and that would lead to it not going through, which I think is why the LDP is writing all this manga. The manga is not for LDP supporters. They're trying to convince everybody else that this is not scary and like we should move forward with this. But it's something I'll definitely give more thought.
Sorry, but two things on that. So that no pocket vote rule is just a simple legislation, not the constitution. So they can change that rule, and they can actually make a proposal of amending multiple articles in the constitution simultaneously, and like propose that as a one single agenda. for the referendum.
Right.
So I guess, that's like that rule change hasn't happened yet. Means something about the partisan preferences on the constitutional amendments, no?
I think that's right. So, when the Constitution says 2/3 in Parliament and then half in referendum, but there was no national referendum law until the 2000s. Like, it wasn't entirely clear how a referendum was going to be held at all. That includes rules on what kind of campaigning you can do during referenda, how many days there should be between the parliamentary vote and the referenda. But the point that Yuki raised as well, which is, do you really need to have separate votes? And what does the non-packaging mean exactly? Right? It doesn't mean article by article. Right? So if you were going to change the name of the prime minister to premier, it would change 12 or 13 articles, but it would be considered one package. But distinct topics are supposed to be kept differently, but there's no rule on who makes the determination of what is distinct versus the same. So, and this is actually something that parties are negotiating on, but it's also one where all small parties want to have some kind of veto power. So they want to ensure that the no package rule is maintained. But this can evolve.
Hi, thank you for a great talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if in your survey results, you also saw if there was a leadership-specific effect in terms of partisan support for these proposals. For example, I remember reading some analysis that, for example, former Prime Minister Kishida was more successful at pushing, security-related reforms because people saw him as more of a dove. People saw him hail from a more moderate faction of LDP, for example, whereas Abe, for example, was to see as more suspicious in terms of pushing these reforms. And so I'm wondering if there was an effect in terms of who was the prime minister at that time and who was doing the proposals of these constitutional amendments. So
in general, I think it is critically important, and it's something that we find, especially with state of emergency provisions. So during crises, you want a stronger government. But the difficulty with state of emergency is, one, maybe the government is the one that caused the crisis, or at least has been unable to solve the crisis. So do you want to give these people more power? And especially if they're seen as having caused the crisis, then trust in that leader is going to decline. So cabinet approval ratings and support for state of emergency is highly correlated. Now, on Article 9 measures, it's a little bit harder to tell because it is very enmeshed in deeper partisan disagreements. But I think one of the reasons why many people said that counterstrike and exporting weapons with lethal capabilities is probably unconstitutional is I think most Japanese citizens don't know that the government has reinterpreted the Constitution to say they can now do this. It's not very widely known, and it's a testament to, I think, Kishida, former Prime Minister Kishida, having an aura of being more centrist and dovish that, it was covered by the media a little bit, but the opposition was focused more on other scandals that the LDP was going through. So this raised fewer ruffles than I would have expected. Now, there are conditions to all of these. Weapons with lethal capabilities are Ukraine-related, for example. So whether this becomes a permanent part of foreign policy is a little bit unclear. But yes, leader effects are very strong on certain constitutional topics.
All right. So there are a couple of questions from Zoom attendees, but in the interest of time, I will limit to one, and I will sort of reinterpret the question and ask on behalf. So the question is about the relationship between the pocketbook and the attitudes to the Constitution. So recently, in Japan, inflation, people are experiencing inflation for the first time in probably
2 decades.
35 years or something. almost entire life, almost my entire life. So, would you see any relationship between sort of the attitudes towards the Constitution or the the perceived legitimacy of the Constitution and the pocketbook economic situations of the people.
Can I reinterpret that question again? I won't. So I don't know how much the pocketbook part directly matters. One amendment that's popular is, or reasonably popular, is creating a debt ceiling of sorts, or a requirement for fiscal rectitude in the Constitution. And to the extent that excessive government spending causes inflation, then there might be a pocketbook-related element to it. But maybe a different way of answering the question is, if people are unhappy about the state of the country and the direction in which it is going, will they think that is a fault of the Constitution or not? Or is it caused by other factors? My guess is people don't attribute their personal dissatisfaction to the Constitution per se. I think they blame the political actors who are either manipulating the Constitution or not following through on their obligations. It's possible that they have suspicions about how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution. I didn't show this earlier, but the Yomiuri occasionally asks the question, do you think the Constitution of Japan has contributed to Japan's prosperity and peace in the post-war period? And about 75 to 80% of people say yes. So insofar as what we're interested in is acceptance of the current Constitution so far, many people seem to be okay with it. And I'm sure some of those people are unhappy with their pocketbook circumstance. But what we don't know is if they're going to continue to be happy with it. Like, is the future trajectory of the country what they want in accordance with what the Constitution can deliver? And that's some of what I'm trying to get at. But linking it to the Constitution, I think it's there, but it's not necessarily the first thing on people's minds.
Okay, I think it's time. So thank you very much, Kenneth, and thank you. Please join me thanking him again.
Thank you very much.